News traveled fast on space stations, and by the time James started his next shift, the medical bay was buzzing with activity. Doctors from various species had gathered to examine the treatment data, and the station's communication channels were filled with requests for information from medical facilities across the sector. The young crystalline, now stable and recovering well, had become the center of attention. She watched with quiet interest as various medical professionals studied her readings and discussed the implications of her treatment. James noticed how she seemed particularly fascinated by the human doctors, who approached her with none of the hesitation shown by other species. "Your treatment data is quite remarkable," said a tall, spindly alien doctor who introduced himself as a specialist in xenobiology. "But surely you realize the risks you took. The chemical interactions could have been catastrophic." James was checking his patient's latest mineral absorption rates when he replied, "Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking one when someone's life is at stake." The readings looked good. Her body was now processing the modified mineral solution without any signs of rejection. The specialist made a clicking sound that the translator interpreted as disapproval. This is exactly why most species prefer to handle their own medical care. The human tendency to improvise can be dangerous. Before James could respond, a chiming sound came from the patient. The translator kicked in. "But I would be dead if he hadn't improvised." Her voice was stronger now, the musical quality of her species' speech becoming more distinct. The xenobiologist withdrew shortly after, but he was quickly replaced by others. Throughout the day, James found himself explaining his thought process again and again, how he had connected human vitamin absorption principles with crystalline biology, how he had modified the treatment when the first attempt began to fail. During a brief quiet moment, the young crystalline spoke to him privately. "My name," she chimed, the translator working smoothly now, "translates roughly to light through crystal. I'm a student at the Crystalline Science Academy. I was researching other species' medical techniques when I became ill." James smiled at the irony. "So you were studying us while we were treating you. Did we provide good research material?" Her crystalline surface rippled in what he had learned was her species' version of laughter. "Better than I expected. My people have avoided outside medical care because we believed other species couldn't understand our needs. We were wrong." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Reed, looking more serious than usual. "Miller, the crystalline embassy has sent representatives. They're waiting in the conference room." He paused, then added, "They don't seem happy." James had been expecting this. He made sure his patient was comfortable, then headed to the conference room. Inside, 3 tall crystalline figures stood waiting, their surfaces shimmering with deep blues and purples that indicated their high status. The tallest one spoke first, their chimes sharp and formal. "You treated one of our people without proper authorization or understanding of our biology. This is a serious breach of protocol." "Yes," James replied simply. "Because she was dying, and protocols don't save lives. Actions do." The crystallines exchanged looks, their surfaces shifting colors slightly. The second one spoke, their tone softer. "Our initial response was concern, but we have reviewed your treatment data. Your solution to our people's mineral absorption issues is innovative, unprecedented. We've also spoken with the patient," the third one added. "She tells us you treated her with respect and dignity, even when others would not help. This is not something we often encounter from other species." James felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "I'm a doctor. My job is to help people who need it, regardless of their species. The fact that your people have different biology doesn't change that basic principle." The meeting continued for another hour, with James explaining every detail of the treatment. The crystalline representatives asked precise, technical questions, their initial hostility gradually giving way to genuine interest. By the end, they had reached an unexpected conclusion. "We would like to propose a medical exchange program," the lead representative announced. Our people have long needed better emergency care options when away from our homeworld. Your approach, while unorthodox, has proven effective. We believe there is much we could learn from each other. Back in the medical bay, James found his patient sitting up, her surface now glowing with healthy colors. She turned to him as he entered. "I heard the embassy representatives were here. Are you in trouble?" "Actually," James replied, checking her latest readings, "I think we just started something new. Your people are interested in learning more about human medical techniques, and we're certainly interested in learning more about crystalline biology." She made the rippling movement again, her version of a smile. "You humans are strange. Other species spend years trying to establish diplomatic relations with us, and you do it by breaking all the rules to save one student." James adjusted her mineral infusion rate slightly before responding. "Maybe that's because we focus on the patient in front of us rather than the rules around us. Sometimes the best way to build trust is to show you're willing to help when it's needed, not just when it's convenient." The medical bay's window had attracted another crowd, but this time it included several crystallines, their surfaces shimmering with interest as they watched the human doctor work. James knew this was just the beginning. There would be papers to write, procedures to formalize, and probably more than a few diplomatic meetings to attend. But right now, none of that mattered as much as the fact that his patient was recovering well. The monitors showed strong, stable readings, and her mineral absorption rates had settled into a healthy pattern. The cracks in her surface had almost completely healed, leaving only faint lines that would fade with time. "You know," she chimed softly, "when I started my research on other species' medical practices, I never expected to become a case study myself. But I think I'd learn more from being your patient than I would have from years of theoretical study." James made a final note in her treatment record before responding. "Sometimes the best way to understand something is to experience it firsthand. Though perhaps next time, try for a less dramatic research method." Her crystalline laughter chimed through the medical bay, a sound that would have been unthinkable just days ago. A crystalline feeling safe enough among other species to express joy. It was a small change, perhaps, but sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest moments of trust. 3 weeks had passed since the emergency treatment, and the medical bay of Nexus 7 looked very different now. A dedicated section had been set up for crystalline patients, complete with specialized mineral infusion equipment based on James's modified design. More surprisingly, there were now 2 crystalline medical practitioners working alongside the regular staff. James was checking supply levels when his first patient, light through crystal, entered the medical bay. She moved with the fluid grace typical of her species, her surface now gleaming with perfect health. She had stayed on the station after her recovery, helping to establish the new medical exchange program. "The latest batch of students arrives tomorrow," she chimed, her translator now perfectly tuned to her voice patterns. 5 from the Science Academy, all eager to learn about human medical techniques. They're particularly interested in your emergency response protocols." James smiled as he finished his inventory. "I still find it hard to believe how quickly things have changed. A month ago, crystallines wouldn't even consider outside medical care. Now we're running joint training programs." The changes hadn't been limited to the medical bay. Throughout the station, attitudes were shifting. Other species that had previously avoided interaction with crystallines were now more open to engagement. The sight of the crystalline beings in public areas no longer caused others to step aside or look away. "It's more than just medical training," Light Through Crystal said, helping James organize a new shipment of mineral supplements. "My people are starting to rethink our isolation. The embassy has received requests for cultural exchange programs, scientific collaborations, even trade agreements." James was about to respond when his emergency comm unit activated. "Medical emergency in Docking Bay 3, the automated system announced. Crystalline patient reporting severe mineral imbalance." Without hesitation, Light Through Crystal moved to accompany him. She had been apprenticing as an emergency responder, learning human rapid response techniques. They grabbed their medical kits and hurried to the docking bay. The scene they found was notably different from that day 3 weeks ago. Instead of avoiding the fallen crystalline, other species were actively helping. A tentacled merchant was providing support, while a tall insectoid was already calling for medical assistance. The difference is remarkable. Light through crystal commented as they began treatment. Before, they would have walked past. Now they know help is available, that it's safe to get involved. The patient was a crystalline trader who had miscalculated his mineral supplement schedule during a long journey. Thanks to the new protocols and equipment, treatment was straightforward. Within minutes, his condition was stabilizing. Back in the medical bay, James updated the treatment records while Light through crystal oriented their newest patient. The steady stream of cases over the past weeks had helped them refine their procedures, making each treatment more efficient than the last. "You've started something significant," Dr. Reed said, entering the bay with a data tablet. "The medical board just approved our proposal for a permanent crystalline medical unit. They're also recommending similar programs at other major stations." James looked around the medical bay, taking in the changes. New equipment designed specifically for crystalline patients sat alongside standard medical gear. The walls now included crystalline light panels that helped patients feel more at home. But the most significant change was in the people, humans and crystallines working side by side, learning from each other. The Science Academy has officially modified its curriculum, Light through Crystal announced, returning from the patient ward. Starting next term, all medical students will study basic emergency care procedures from other species, with a focus on human techniques. A small group of medical students, a mix of humans and other species, gathered near the observation window, watching as James demonstrated the proper use of the new mineral infusion equipment. The sight would have been unthinkable just a few weeks ago. "You know," James said as he finished the demonstration, "when I first treated you, I was just trying to save one life. I never expected it to lead to all this." Light through crystal's surface shimmered with amusement. "That's perhaps the most important lesson we've learned from humans. You don't set out to change the world. You just help whoever needs it, and sometimes the world changes anyway." The afternoon brought another emergency call, this time from the commercial sector. A young crystalline had experienced a sudden mineral crash while shopping. When James and Light through crystal arrived, they found something unexpected. A human shop owner had already started basic mineral stabilization using an emergency kit that was now standard in all station businesses. "I remember what happened with that student a few weeks ago," the shop owner explained. "Figured it was worth keeping supplies on hand, just in case. Seems like it paid off." This kind of preparation and awareness was spreading throughout the station. Other medical facilities had begun requesting information about the new treatment protocols. The station's success story was becoming a model for others to follow. As they treated the patient, James noticed Light through crystal, explaining the procedure to a group of curious onlookers. Her natural teaching ability had made her invaluable in training both medical staff and the general public. "The key," she was saying, "is understanding that despite our different biologies, the principle of helping others remains constant. Humans taught us that medical care isn't just about technical knowledge. It's about being willing to help, to learn, and to adapt." Later, reviewing the day's cases, James found himself reflecting on how much had changed. The medical bay's records now included successful treatments for dozens of crystalline patients. More importantly, the fear and isolation that had characterized their medical care was disappearing. "We're receiving another delegation tomorrow," Light through crystal informed him, her surface glowing with excitement. "Medical administrators from 3 different stations. They want to establish similar programs in their facilities." James nodded, updating the last of his patient records. "It's amazing how helping one person can lead to helping many. Though I have to admit, I never expected to become an expert in crystalline medicine." "You're not just an expert in crystalline medicine," she chimed softly. You're proof that sometimes the best medical care comes from simply being willing to help, even when others won't. My people are learning that isolation doesn't make us safer, it just makes us alone. The medical bay's lights dimmed slightly for the night shift, but the work would continue. Somewhere on the station, someone would need help, and now they would find it. Regardless of their species, regardless of protocols, simply because someone had decided that helping others was more important than following rules. 1 year had passed since that fateful day in the maintenance corridor. James stood in the newly expanded medical center of Nexus 7, watching as the latest group of medical students, human and crystalline alike, practiced emergency response procedures together. The small medical bay had grown into a full department, now serving as the primary training facility for cross-species medical care in this sector of space. Light through crystal, no longer just a patient or student, but now a fully qualified medical practitioner, was leading the training session. Her surface gleamed with confidence as she demonstrated proper emergency response techniques to the attentive group. "Remember," she chimed, her translator perfectly conveying her passionate tone, "in emergency medicine, we don't see species, we see patients. That's the most important lesson we learned from our human colleagues." James smiled at the familiar words. They were his own, spoken during that first critical treatment a year ago. Now they had become part of the standard training manual for all new medical staff on the station. The emergency comm system activated, its tone familiar but still urgent. "Medical emergency in commercial section v. multiple patients. Mineral depletion incident." Without hesitation, 3 response teams mobilize. A smooth mixture of human and crystalline medical staff, moving with practiced efficiency. James joined the first team, with Light through crystal coordinating the response. They arrived to find a group of crystalline tourists affected by a temporary failure in the section's mineral atmosphere processors. A year ago, this would have been a disaster. Now, it was a well-managed emergency. Shop owners had already started basic stabilization procedures, using the emergency kits that had become standard equipment throughout the station. "See how the humans respond without fear," Light through crystal commented as they worked. "And look at our people. No hesitation in accepting help. This is what real change looks like." The patients were stabilized quickly, thanks to the practiced coordination between human and crystalline medical staff. As they worked, James noticed other species watching with interest rather than the old anxiety or indifference. Some even offered to help, asking what they could do to assist. Back at the medical center, James was updating treatment records when Dr. Reed entered, accompanied by several official-looking crystallines. Their surfaces shimmered with the formal patterns of high governmental positions. "The council has reached a decision," one of them announced, their chimes resonating with authority. "The success of the Nexus 7 program has proven the value of cross-species medical cooperation. We are establishing similar programs at all major space stations in crystalline territory." Reed smiled at James. "They want you to help set up the training programs. You've become something of a legend in cross-species medicine, Miller." James shook his head modestly. "I just did what any doctor would do. Tried to help someone who needed it. Everything else came from people working together, learning from each other." Light through crystal, who had just finished with the last patient, joined them. "You humans have a saying. Actions speak louder than words. One action of kindness did more to change relations between our species than years of diplomatic talks." The medical center's main hall was busy with activity. Students from various species practiced together, sharing knowledge and techniques. The walls displayed medical information in multiple languages, including the musical notations of crystalline script. Most importantly, the fear and distrust that had once separated species was noticeably absent. "We're receiving applications from other species now," Reed mentioned, reviewing his data tablet. "They've seen what we've accomplished with human crystalline cooperation. They want to be part of it." Indeed, the medical center had begun accepting students from several other species, each bringing their own unique perspectives and knowledge to share. The program that had started with one emergency treatment was evolving into something much broader, a true interspecies medical community. James watched as a young crystalline student confidently treated a human patient's minor injury, while a human student assisted a crystalline elder with mineral supplements. These sights, once unthinkable, were now routine. "You know," Light Through Crystal said, joining him at the observation window, "I never did properly thank you for that day. Not just for saving my life, but for showing us a better way." James turned to his colleague, no longer just a patient, but a partner in building something new. "You don't need to thank me. What we've built here, what we're continuing to build, that's thanks enough." The day continued with its usual mix of emergencies, training sessions, and routine care. But now each case was an opportunity for learning, for breaking down barriers, for showing that different species could do more than just coexist. They could actively help each other. As his shift ended, James took a final walk through the medical center. He passed the emergency response bay, now equipped to handle patients of any species. He saw the training rooms where future doctors learned to look past physical differences to see the patient in need. He watched students of various species studying together, sharing knowledge and experiences. A small plaque caught his eye, newly installed near the entrance. It read in multiple languages, including crystalline chimes. "Medical care knows no species. Here, all who need help will find it." Light Through Crystal stood beside him, reading the plaque. "It's becoming true, isn't it? What started with one human helping one crystalline has grown into something that's changing how species interact across space." James nodded, remembering that day in the maintenance corridor. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices, like stopping to help someone when others walk past. The medical center's lights dimmed slightly for the night shift, but the work would continue. Somewhere, someone would need help, and they would find it here, not because of protocols or politics, but because of people who believed that helping others was the most natural thing in the universe. And perhaps that was humanity's greatest gift to the stars. Not their technology or their strength, but their simple, unwavering belief that everyone deserved help when they needed it, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. "I've never seen anything like this," Reed admitted, studying the treatment data. "You essentially created a new medical procedure by combining human vitamin absorption principles with crystalline biology. The medical board will want to study this in detail." James was more interested in his patient's readings than in what the medical board might think. The young crystalline was recovering well now, her vital signs strong and steady. More importantly, her body was continuing to process the new treatment solution effectively. "It wasn't just medical knowledge that made this work," James said, making notes for the treatment record. "It was remembering that despite how alien someone might seem, the basic principles of life tend to be similar. Bodies know what they need. Sometimes we just have to help them get it in the right way." The crystalline's eyes opened fully for the first time since the crisis began. Through the translator, her voice came clearer now. "The pain. It's gone. How did you know what to do?" James smiled as he checked her latest readings. "I didn't, exactly. But I've learned that sometimes the best medicine comes from understanding not just how bodies work, but how living things work together. Your people might look very different from humans, but we all need help sometimes." The medical bay's observation window had gathered quite a crowd, not just medical staff now, but other station personnel, and even a few aliens. Word had spread about the unprecedented treatment, about the human medic who had not only saved a crystalline, but had developed a new way to treat their mineral deficiencies. But James wasn't thinking about any of that as he watched his patient's steady recovery. He was thinking about all the times in his career when standard procedures and established protocols hadn't been enough. Sometimes, the most important medical tool wasn't technology or knowledge. It was the willingness to try something new while remembering something very old. That all living things, no matter how different they might appear, shared some basic needs. And sometimes, meeting those needs just required a different approach. The young crystalline surface now shimmered with healthy colors, the crisis finally truly over. But for James, this felt like a beginning rather than an end. They'd broken new ground today, not just in treating crystallines, but in showing that human medical creativity could bridge gaps that protocols and prejudices had left untouched for too long. The next few hours in the medical bay were the most challenging of James's career. The initial success with the mineral treatment had given them hope, but now they faced a new crisis. The young crystalline's condition had started to deteriorate again, her newly stabilized surface beginning to cloud over with an alarming gray tinge. "Something's wrong," James muttered, checking the readings for the 5th time in as many minutes. The mineral absorption rates had dropped dramatically, and the patient's core temperature was rising instead of staying steady. He'd seen similar reactions in human patients when their bodies rejected treatments, but this was happening much faster. The monitoring equipment filled the room with a series of urgent beeps. James focused on the biochemical readings, trying to understand what had changed. The basic mineral solution had worked at first, so why was it failing now? He thought back to his combat medicine training. They'd had a saying back then: when the standard treatment fails, look for what's different. In the field, that usually meant checking for hidden injuries or unusual environmental factors. But here, in this sterile medical bay, what was he missing? The answer hit him as he watched a drop of the mineral solution slide off the crystalline surface. "It's not absorbing properly anymore," he said aloud, his mind racing. "We're treating this like human mineral deficiency, but crystallines aren't just walking crystals. They're living beings with complex systems." He quickly pulled up the limited data they had on crystalline biology. There had to be something he'd overlooked. His eyes scanned the text until he found it. A small note about their natural growth cycles. Crystallines didn't just absorb minerals. They processed them through a complex series of chemical reactions, similar to how humans digested food. "We need to change the delivery method," James announced to the medical team that had gathered. The direct mineral infusion worked for emergency stabilization, but for proper absorption, we need to mimic their natural processes. Dr. Reed, who had stayed to monitor the situation, looked skeptical. "And how exactly do you propose we do that? We barely understand their basic biology, let alone their metabolic processes." James was already moving to the medical bay's chemical synthesis unit. In humans, vitamin D helps with calcium absorption. The principle might be similar here. We need catalysts, not just raw minerals. He began adjusting the chemical composition of the treatment solution, adding trace elements that could help trigger the patient's natural absorption processes. The young crystalline stirred, her surface crackling faintly as she tried to move. Through the translator, her voice came as weak chimes. "It burns." "Hang on," James told her, his fingers flying over the control panel. "I know it hurts, but we're going to fix this." He'd seen that kind of pain before, not in crystallines, but in human patients whose bodies were fighting against treatments that were almost, but not quite, right. The new mixture looked different from the first. Instead of the clear solution they'd used before, this one had a slight iridescent quality, almost like oil on water. James loaded it into the delivery system, then hesitated for just a moment. If he was wrong about this, he could make things much worse. But the alternative was watching his patient die slowly as her body rejected the original treatment. Sometimes, he reminded himself, the biggest risk was not taking one when it was needed. He started the new treatment, watching the monitors intently. For several tense minutes, nothing seemed to change. The crystalline's vital signs continued to fluctuate dangerously, and the gray tinge on her surface spread further. Then, gradually, something began to happen. The new solution didn't just sit on her surface like the old one had. It seemed to shimmer and then sink in, absorbed in a way that looked much more natural. The patient's breathing eased, and the gray tinge began to recede. "Look at these readings," one of the junior medics said, pointing to the biochemical monitor. "The absorption rates are stabilizing, but they're following a completely different pattern now." James nodded, relief washing over him. Because we're not forcing the minerals in anymore. We're letting her body process them naturally. He adjusted the flow rate slightly, matching it to the patient's improving absorption levels. The next hour showed steady improvement. The crystalline surface began to regain its natural luster, this time in a way that seemed more sustainable than the first treatment. The cracks that had started to reopen were closing again, and her core temperature was returning to normal range. Those simple words strengthened his resolve. James began administering the modified mineral solution through a specially calibrated field that would help her crystalline structure absorb the elements. It was a technique they used for human bone regeneration, adapted on the fly for an entirely different species. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The cracks continued to spread, and the monitoring equipment still showed declining vital signs. Reed stepped forward, ready to call a stop to the procedure, but James held up a hand. Wait, look at the absorption rates. The readings were changing. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, the crystalline's body began taking in the mineral solution. The dusty residue stopped forming, and the spread of cracks slowed. James adjusted the mixture slightly, guided by the real-time data. Impossible, Reed muttered, studying the readings. Her matrix is actually stabilizing. How did you know this would work? James kept his eyes on the monitors as he replied. I didn't, but I've learned that different species aren't as different as we think when it comes to the basics. We all need structural integrity, energy, a way to repair damage. The methods might be different, but the principles are often similar. The next hour was tense, filled with careful adjustments and constant monitoring. But gradually, unmistakably, the crystalline's condition began to improve. Her surface regained some of its luster, and the smaller cracks started to heal. The larger ones would take time, but she was no longer in immediate danger. As James recorded the successful treatment procedure for future reference, he could hear the excited murmur of voices outside the medical bay. The news would spread quickly through the station. Humans weren't known for their advanced medical technology or deep understanding of alien biology, but they were becoming known for something else. The willingness to try what others wouldn't, to help when others walked past. Reed was already on his comm unit, presumably dealing with the bureaucratic aftermath. But before he left the medical bay, he paused beside James. The medical board will want a full report, and the crystalline embassy will probably have questions. This could still cause problems. James nodded, checking his patient's vital signs one more time. They were stable, improving steadily. I know. But look at her. She's alive. Whatever comes next, that makes it worth it. The young crystalline had drifted into a healing sleep, her surface now gently pulsing with a soft light that indicated normal metabolic functions. On the monitors, her mineral absorption rates had stabilized at healthy levels. The emergency was over, but James knew this was just the beginning. They'd have to develop a proper treatment plan, document everything for future cases, probably deal with a lot of diplomatic questions. But they'd crossed an important barrier today, not just in treating a crystalline successfully, but in showing that sometimes the best medical care came not from advanced technology or detailed biological knowledge, but from the simple human willingness to help first and worry about the rules later. The medical bay's bright lights reflected off the crystalline's fading surface as James rushed to access the station's medical database. His fingers moved quickly across the holographic interface, while the monitoring equipment beeped with increasing urgency. The database entry for crystalline physiology was frustratingly brief. Just a few paragraphs about their silicon-based biology and a warning about their sensitivity to certain mineral imbalances. This is getting us nowhere, James muttered, glancing at his patient. The cracks in her crystalline structure were spreading slowly but steadily. He'd seen something similar before, during his combat medic days, when human soldiers suffered severe calcium deficiencies under prolonged siege conditions. Their bones would become brittle, prone to fractures. The symptoms looked different, but the underlying principle might be similar. The medical bay's door slid open, And Dr. Reed, the station's chief medical officer, walked in with a stern expression. "Miller, what do you think you're doing? We have protocols for a reason." James didn't look up from his work. "With all due respect, Doctor, she'll be dead before those protocols run their course. Look at these readings." He projected the scanner data onto the main screen. "Her mineral matrix is collapsing. It's like severe osteoporosis in humans, but accelerated." Reed frowned at the displays. "You can't just make that comparison. Their biology is completely different from ours. Any treatment based on human medical knowledge could kill her faster." "Maybe," James admitted, "but doing nothing will definitely kill her." He pulled up his old combat medical records, searching for the treatments he'd used for mineral deficiencies. During the Frontier Wars, we had to adapt human treatments for all sorts of species. Sometimes the only choice is an educated guess. The monitors chimed another warning. The crystalline's core temperature was dropping further, and the cracks in her surface were beginning to emit a faint, dusty residue. James recognized it as a sign of structural breakdown, the crystalline equivalent of organ failure. "I need access to the emergency mineral supplements," James said, already moving toward the storage unit. "The ones we use for human bone trauma." "Absolutely not." Reed blocked his path. "That's a direct violation of at least 3 sections of the Medical Safety Act. I won't allow you to experiment on a patient." James stood his ground. "Doctor, what's the first rule they taught us in medical school? First, do no harm. But doing nothing when someone's dying, that's doing harm by inaction. We took an oath to help people." "People, yes, but she's not." "If you finish that sentence," James interrupted, his voice quiet but firm, "you'll be violating the Interstellar Medical Ethics Code. Section 1. All sentient beings have an equal right to life-saving medical care." A tense silence filled the room, broken only by the steady beeping of monitors. Reed looked from James to the dying crystalline, then back again. Finally, his shoulders slumped slightly. "This is on your head, Miller. I'll note my official protest. But do what you need to do." James didn't waste any time. He quickly prepared a mixture of mineral supplements, carefully calculating the concentrations based on what little data they had about crystalline biology. It was a risk, but a calculated one. The basic elements needed for crystal formation weren't that different, whether you were talking about bones or living gems. As he worked, he noticed other medical staff gathering at the bay's windows, watching with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Word had spread quickly about the human medic treating a crystalline. Some were probably waiting to see him fail. There was a reason most aliens stuck to their own kind for medical care. The young crystalline's eyes followed his movements, her gaze containing both fear and hope. James paused in his preparations to speak to her. "I know this isn't how your people usually handle medical emergencies, but I promise you, I'm doing everything I can to help. Do you understand?" Her response came through the translator as a whispered chime. "Others walked past. You stayed. I trust." James looked at the young crystalline. Her breathing was becoming more labored, tiny crystals flaking off her skin with each movement. He knew the protocol. It was put in place after several diplomatic incidents involving mishandled alien medical care. But he also knew that waiting for proper authorization would take hours, time his patient didn't have. "Override protocol. Authorization Miller 7-19, he said firmly into his comm. "Invoking emergency responder discretion under Section 4 of the Medical Ethics Code. Patient will not survive bureaucratic delays." There was a pause. Then, "Override noted. Be advised, this action will be reported to Station Medical Board. Transport incoming." James turned back to his patient, pulling out an emergency thermal blanket. The crystalline's eyes focused on him briefly, a look of surprise crossing her angular features. He suspected she hadn't expected anyone to help, especially not a human. "Stay with me," he said, carefully wrapping the blanket around her to prevent further mineral loss. "I know your people don't usually trust outside medical care, but I'm not going to let you die in a maintenance corridor." The medical transport arrived, a hovering stretcher guided by two of his human colleagues. They looked uncertainly at the crystalline patient, then at James. "You sure about this?" one of them asked quietly. "The paperwork alone will take weeks, and that's if her people don't file a complaint." James carefully lifted the crystalline onto the stretcher. "Look at her crystal structure. She's young, probably some kind of student or researcher. Probably got separated from her group, maybe ran out of whatever supplements they use. We can't just let her die because of paperwork." As they rushed toward the medical bay, James noticed how the crowds parted. Some aliens looked on with disapproval, others with curiosity, but most simply looked away. He had seen this before, the tendency of various species to avoid getting involved in others' problems. It wasn't necessarily cruel, just a deeply ingrained cultural norm in many spacefaring races. But humans had never been good at following those kinds of norms. Maybe that's why, despite being relative newcomers to the galactic community, humans had quickly become known as the ones you called when everything else had failed. They weren't always the smartest, or the strongest, or the most technologically advanced, but they were often the ones willing to try when everyone else had given up. The medical bay doors slid open automatically as they approached. James was already planning his next steps. The standard database would have minimal information on crystalline physiology. They were notoriously private about their medical needs, but he had seen enough cases, treated enough minor injuries, to have some ideas. As they transferred his patient to a treatment bed, her eyes found his again. This time she managed to speak, her voice creating a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The translator in his comm unit processed the sounds. "Why? Help." James checked the mineral analysis readings while responding. "Because you needed it. That's all the reason anyone should need." He didn't mention that he was probably breaking a dozen regulations and might lose his license over this. That wasn't important right now. The monitors showed her condition still deteriorating. James knew he had minutes, maybe less, to figure out how to stabilize her. As he began to set up emergency mineral infusion equipment, he could hear the station's medical board already beginning to argue over his comm channel about protocols and procedures. He turned off the comm. The paperwork, the complaints, the bureaucracy, all of that could wait. Right now, he had a patient to save, and that was all that mattered. As he prepared the first round of treatment, James reflected that this was perhaps the most human thing about him. The stubborn refusal to walk past someone in need, regardless of the consequences. The young crystalline's glow had dimmed even further, but her eyes remained fixed on the human who had stopped to help when no one else would. And in that moment, though neither of them knew it, they were both part of something larger. Another small chapter in humanity's growing reputation among the stars, not as conquerors or geniuses, but as the ones who would help, simply because they could. The familiar hum of Nexus 7's environmental systems filled the air as James Miller walked through the crowded maintenance corridor of the space station. His medical kit bounced against his hip with each step, a constant reminder of his duties as an emergency responder. After 8 years as a combat medic on Earth's frontier colonies and another 5 on this bustling trade station, he had grown used to the weird and wonderful diversity of alien life that crossed his path every day. The station's artificial lighting flickered momentarily, casting strange shadows across the metal walls. James checked his comm unit. Another quiet day, which was usually a good thing in his line of work. He decided to do one more round before heading back to the medical bay for his report. The maintenance corridor was less crowded than the main thoroughfares, used mostly by station staff and those who preferred to avoid the tourist-heavy areas. As he turned a corner, something caught his eye. A faint shimmer on the floor ahead, like scattered light from a crystal chandelier. His walking pace quickened as he realized what he was seeing. A young crystalline lay crumpled on the floor, her normally brilliant gem-like skin dulled to an alarming opacity. What shocked him more was the behavior of those passing by. A tall insectoid alien simply stepped over her, while a group of tentacled merchants gave her a wide berth, their eye stalks deliberately looking away. "Hey," James called out, but the passing aliens quickened their pace, clearly wanting nothing to do with the situation. He rushed forward, his medical training kicking in automatically. The crystalline couldn't have been more than the equivalent of a human teenager, her angular features still showing signs of youth. James knelt beside her, pulling out his medical scanner. Her surface temperature was far below normal crystalline ranges. He'd treated enough of their minor injuries to know that much. Her crystalline structure, usually a brilliant blue-green, had faded to a sickly white, with thin cracks spreading across her surface. "Can you hear me?" he asked, keeping his voice calm and professional. The crystalline's eyes flickered, two deep purple orbs that seemed to catch all available light. Her mouth moved, but only a weak chiming sound emerged, characteristic of her species' language. His scanner beeped with preliminary results, and James felt his heart sink. The readings were bad, very bad. Her mineral content was critically low, something that for a crystalline was equivalent to severe blood loss in a human. Without immediate treatment, her crystalline matrix would begin to break down. A small crowd had begun to gather, watching from a distance. James activated his comm unit. "Emergency medical response. This is Miller. I need immediate transport for a crystalline patient in Maintenance Corridor C7. Critical condition." The response came back almost immediately. "Negative. Responder Miller. We have no registered crystalline patients on file. Station protocol requires proper documentation and species-specific medical authorization before treatment."